It is 7:31, and I think we have time for one more story. So, this is the story of John Henry. I don't know, it looks like he might have lived a long time ago too, by the look of that log cabin. The night John Henry was born, the moon was red and the sky was black. The wind howled and the rain poured. Lightning flashed and thunder rolled. Panthers growled and owls hooted. Woo! And the Mississippi River ran 1,000 miles upstream. The Mississippi River started going the other direction. Right on the stroke of midnight.
Why?
That's just what they're saying. That's the legend. Right on the stroke of midnight. What time is midnight?
The Mississippi River is
12 o'clock.
Supposed to go that way.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, did I?
Yeah, but instead it went the other way.
Yeah.
John Henry was born with a hammer in his hand.
Why?
I don't know. That's what it says.
What
That's
was
the
hammer
legend.
in his head?
Is a hammer?
His daddy looked at him and then looked out at the storm. All this goings on has got to mean something, he said. And I reckon it's telling us that we ain't got no ordinary baby here. We got ourselves a real man. John Henry was awfully big and strong for a newborn baby. He grew fast, getting bigger and stronger every day. As he learned to crawl around the house, his hammer rang out. Bang! Bang! Soon he was walking, and by the time he was 4 years old, John Henry was big enough to help with the chores. Honey, his mama said to him one day, I know how you love that hammer, but your daddy needs your help picking cotton and hoeing corn, so you're going to have to set your hammer down a while. John Henry
Daddy was born with it.
He was born with a hammer in his hand. John Henry always did what his mama told him, so he hung his hammer up on the wall. Then he stared up at it and he whispered, Mama, I just know that hammer's gonna be the death of me one day. John Henry worked, I don't know. John Henry worked beside...
Death of me someday?
Death of me, it means he thinks it'll bring him to an end. It'll, like, make him die. We'll see. John Henry worked beside his father. He weeded and he hoed. He pushed a plow across the fields, and he listened when his daddy told him, If you do a job, son, you may as well do it right. Before long, John Henry had learned to use an axe, a saw, and a chisel, but nothing felt as good in his hands as a hammer. At last, one evening, when he was almost full grown, John Henry went to his daddy and his mama and said, You always told me how I was a real man, and real men should do what they do best. All this hoeing and plowing ain't natural to me. I gotta find a job where I got a hammer in my hand. His daddy nodded sadly, and his mama cried a little, but they both knew John Henry was right. Go on then, son, his daddy said. You gotta find your own way and your own star so you can be what you're meant to be.
You should do your job. He wants to do his job that he likes most.
Yeah, that's right. What he's good at.
Like everybody does.
Yeah, that's true.
He's probably gonna be a hammer man.
Yeah.
Well, what would be
Like
a
a
job
builder
where
with a hammer.
you use a hammer? What's a good job for a guy that uses a hammer?
Worker man.
A
Worker man?
And he could be and he could bring his born, his hammer that he was born with, the year was it.
So John Henry packed up his hammer and his other belongings and set off.
Packed up his hammer.
It wasn't long before he had a job as a cotton picker on a large plantation. He picked cotton from dawn to dusk under the blazing hot sun. No one had ever picked cotton like John Henry did. 4,000 pounds a day. After a while, though, he decided he had to move on. The owner begged him to stay and offered to pay him more money, but John Henry only shook his head.
Because he wanted to do what John was like.
Yeah, because how much do you use a hammer for picking cotton?
Yeah.
Not at all, right?
Yeah.
Lord knows I don't mind hard work, he said, but I'm a real man and this work ain't natural to me. I need the feel of a hammer in my hand. Down the road a ways, John
I
Henry
need to feel it in my hand.
John Henry came to the edge of the great Mississippi River. There he saw a riverboat named the Diamond Joe pulling into port. John Henry stared at it and thought, maybe if I get me a job on that riverboat, it'll carry me far away, someplace where they got a need for a real man like me, a man with a hammer in his hand. So he went straight away and spoke to the captain. The captain took one look at him and hired him on the spot. Any employer would, for years of hard labor had made John Henry so strong that his legs were as thick as tree trunks, and his arms looked as if they were carved of iron. John Henry's job was to load the heavy cargo on board and to feed the furnace with great shovelfuls of wood and coal. The Diamond Joe sailed up and down the great Mississippi River, past big, lively cities and small, pleasant towns.
Daddy, how deep is the Mississippi River?
I'm not completely sure, but I guess it varies a lot. Maybe between, I don't know, at its deepest, maybe it could be as deep as 30 feet, and maybe shallowest, maybe more like 10 feet. I could be wrong about the deepest. It might only be like 20 feet. Small, pleasant towns, past wide green fields and cold, dark
if a giant
forests.
ship could sail in it.
Yeah, if a giant ship can sail in it, it
Look at
has to be pretty
Really?
deep. Yeah, like our boat draws 4.5 feet, but the ferry boat is about probably more like 10 feet. So it's hard to know exactly what the Mississippi's depth is.
It's probably less big than the ferry boat.
Yeah, it doesn't. The bottom on a riverboat's probably flatter and less deep.
Mm-hmm.
Our ferry boat goes on the big ocean, so it wants more of a keel for the waves. The river doesn't have huge waves. All right. Past big lively cities, small pleasant towns, past wide green fields and cool dark forests. There are always new places to see, but none of them seem to have a need for a man like John Henry. One summer night, John Henry stood on deck and stared up at the sky. He remembered what his daddy had told him when they said goodbye, and he shook his head. "I ain't found it yet," he whispered. "I ain't found the road and the star for me." He looked up at the sky and wondered which of all the stars was his. Suddenly, the Diamond Joe gave a great lurch as the bottom of the boat scraped the riverbed and came to a sudden stop. The bottom of the river. So you were asking me how deep it was. Well, it wasn't deep enough for the riverboat for this part of the passage, and it hit bottom. But hitting bottom on a river is not as bad as like hitting a rock ledge out in the ocean, right? "We've run aground," the first mate shouted. "She's sinking fast," the captain hollered. Oh, I was wrong. They might have hit a rock or something. They got holed. Oh, if we don't get her off this sandbar, we're going to capsize. Oh, so it seems to be tipping over instead of sinking straight down. "Captain," John Henry called, "maybe I can push the bow out of the mud." Then, before anyone on board could blink...
So your form was that thing?
I don't know. He jumped off the boat into the muddy water. The mud came all the way up to his chest, but that didn't trouble John Henry. He just heaved and pushed as the captain shouted, "Full steam ahead!" Slowly, slowly, the big riverboat began to move forward. "Good God Almighty!" the pilot cried. "John Henry's pushing us out of the mud." Then John Henry gave one last mighty heave, setting the Diamond Joe afloat again. When John Henry climbed back aboard, the crew gathered around him, cheering and clapping him on the back. So,
Daddy, I don't really like that.
well, they weren't.
I don't really like people gathering around me and cheering.
No, can't be that bad. So I don't think they were really holed or taking on water, because if you pushed them off the sandbar, now they're in deep water, they wouldn't be cheering and having a good time if the boat was holed, right? So it was just stuck aground. Soon, the Diamond Joe pulled into port for repairs, and John Henry decided to wander around town until the boat was ready. He found himself on a high bluff, and looking down, he saw a group of men laying a new railroad track. Some men took turns hammering big steel rods into the rock to break it up.
He probably wants to do that.
Yeah. And make a level bed for the ties. So the railroad ties are like, so there's the railroad track, and then the ties
Daddy,
between it.
You're born, Daddy. Imagine.
That keep it spaced perfectly.
Imagine they split it out, her tummy, and you saw Mama's tummy, and you saw a tiny little strong baby that was already able to lift another baby up. Yeah. That's older than him, but he has a hammer clutched to his
No,
chest.
that part's crazy. Other men carried heavy steel rails and placed them across the wooden ties. Then others took huge steel hammers and pounded steel spikes into the ties.
Daddy, how were they able to how was she able to form a baby with and a hammer?
That's a very good question.
I
don't know
know.
how that was done. Sparks flew as steel struck steel, and the hammer strokes echoed through the air. The noise of those hammers sounded like church bells to John Henry. "This is it," he cried. "That's the work I was born to do.
I know.
Work fit for a real man with a hammer in his hand." He raced down the bluff and asked the track foreman to give him a job. "You ever done any steel driving before?" the foreman asked, looking John Henry up and down. John Henry drew himself up. "I was born with a hammer in my hand," he replied proudly. "This work's as natural to me as breathing is." Before the foreman could say no, John Henry reached down and took up a 12-pound hammer. Then he joined two men who were driving steel rods into the rock. The first man struck the rod with a clang. The second one followed. John Henry raised his hammer high. It seemed like he'd been holding his breath all his life, waiting for this moment. Then he brought his hammer down with a mighty blow right on the head of that steel rod. With just one blow, John Henry sank that rod all the way into the rock. The track foreman's mouth fell open. The men standing around swore. The sound of John Henry's mighty hammer stroke echoed through the mountains. "You're hired, friend," the foreman shouted. "I ain't never seen a man who could drive steel like you can." So John Henry became a steel-driving man. Soon, everybody up and down the railroad had heard about John Henry, for he was the best steel-driving man there ever was. Finally, he had found the work he was made for.
I know.
Before long, John Henry found himself a wife, too. She was a slender, sweet-faced woman named Polly Ann, and he truly loved her. "I found my road, and I found my star," he told himself. And it don't seem like there's a thing left to wish for." Yet he still caught himself dreaming of doing something more, something extraordinary, though what that might be he couldn't say. One day, the head of the C&C Railroad sent one of his men to offer John Henry a new job. He had heard all about John Henry and his hammer. The C&O was building a railroad track through the Big Bend Mountain in West Virginia.
Daddy, now they think it's actually true. He was born with a hammer in his hand.
Now they might believe it. It would be the longest railroad tunnel ever made.
Do you think the woman who married him believes that when they sliced open the mama's tummy, they saw a tiny little baby clutching a hammer?
I guess the word spreads, and she probably talked to his mother.
Remember when Daddy, I wish that he was born with a hammer in his hand.
Yeah.
That's why.
Why?
Because then he would be able to, because then if he was getting away, like when he ran out Max Alice and the girl didn't let him out. And he was
I'm glad he didn't have it.
at the door and about to go through, to get through to that. And you caught him.
I think it's best if your baby brother isn't born with a hammer.
Because then he would have been banging at the door and we
You're
would
right.
have caught him.
He might have gotten away.
Oh.
It would,
Because Daddy would be banging on it. So
and we would have heard him, so that would have been like, that would be like an alarm for us to run and get him.
Yeah.
Good point.
But
It would be the longest railroad tunnel ever made, and they wanted John Henry to do their steel driving.
Daddy,
When John
I need to go
Henry...
poo-poo.
Okay. Oops, gentle. When John Henry saw the Big Bend Mountain, he could hardly believe his eyes. It was the biggest mountain he'd ever seen. He knew that the work would be difficult, but that didn't bother him. All he wanted was to hammer all day long and be the best steel-driving man
Daddy.
in the work. So he took the job. The head of the company was glad. He knew the work would be hard and dangerous, but if John Henry led the way, the other men would follow.
In my hand.
That's right. So we're going to finish reading about
I
John
want
Henry.
a job with a hammer in my hand.
Soon, work on the Big Bend Tunnel began. First, John Henry and his men drilled deep holes in the mountainside. Then other men, called the Powder Boys, stuffed the holes with dynamite and blew out the rock. So the Big Bend Tunnel slowly began to take shape. Deeper and deeper into the dark mountain the crew tunneled. But none of the men felt afraid, for they could always hear the sound of John Henry's hammer up ahead of them. It sounded like the beating of a strong, steady heart. "Time to blast her out again," the crew boss said one day. The Powder Boys laid in the dynamite and lit the fuse. But as the fuse began burning down, the walls of the tunnel began to rumble and shake. "It's a cave-in!" the men shrieked. John Henry and his crew scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. Meanwhile, the fuse was still burning closer and closer to the dynamite. "Hold on, I'll put her out," John Henry hollered, and he raced to the fuse. He had almost reached it when he tripped and fell. There was no time to get up again. Whop! John Henry threw his mighty hammer. It landed right on the burning fuse, a split hair before it reached the dynamite. The flames sizzled out, and the men cautiously rose to their feet. They'd been saved by John Henry and his hammer. "Ain't nothing that John Henry can't do," his men boasted. And a few days later, John Henry proved it again. That day, the crew was hard at work when they heard a strange noise. "What's that, boss?" asked John Henry's friend, Little Bill. "I don't rightly know myself," replied John Henry. Just then, a big steel contraption came rumbling down the tunnel behind them, belching smoke and flames. "This here's a steam drill," the man from the railroad office told the foreman, "and it can do more work than any 16 men combined."
What's a steam drill?
It's a giant drill powered by like a steam engine, I guess. Sort of like the old trains. "I don't know about that," the foreman answered. "I got John Henry here, and he's mighty good." "That's the truth, all right," put in Little Bill, speaking up for his friend. "Ain't no machine in the world that can beat John Henry when his hammer's going strong." All the men cried, "John Henry can beat that thing." Then John Henry looked at the machine and said, "Yes, sir, I reckon I could." So the railroad boss said they should have a contest the very next day. John Henry and Little Bill against the new steam drill. The word quickly spread, and the next morning 1,000 people gathered to see John Henry race against the new machine.
Boom, boom. John Henry is hammer.
Polly Ann was up in front in her best blue dress. "Don't work yourself too hard, John Henry," she said. "Don't worry," John Henry replied, kissing her for luck. "You watch, Polly. I'm gonna beat this thing." With a pistol shot, the race began. The machine screeched to life, and Little Bill positioned his drill. Then John Henry swung his mighty hammer, and as his hammer struck Bill's drill, the air all around sang. Rattling and shaking, the machine blundered through the mountainside, and John Henry replied with stroke after mighty stroke, but it was no good. Through the sparks and smoke, Little Bill could see the steam drill was pulling ahead. The race went on hour after hour, and still John Henry kept going as fast as ever, but the machine kept going too. Sweat poured down John Henry's face, and the handle of his hammer and Little Bill's drill grew red hot. So Polly Ann poured cool jugs of water over them to keep them going, and on they went with the steam drill just ahead. The sun began to sink in the sky. In the dark tunnel, John Henry turned to Little Bill and sang out, "A man ain't nothing but a man, and before I let this machine beat me, I'll die with a hammer in my hand. That steam drill's still up ahead, but I'll keep swinging till I'm dead. And as this here hammer just won't do, go on, reach on down and hand me two. Yeah, reach on down, Little Bill. Yeah, reach on down and hand me 2. So Little Bill handed him 2 20-pound hammers, and with one in either hand, John Henry started swinging. He swung those hammers so fast his arms became a blur. The rock crumbled and melted away before him. His great hammer strokes rang down the tunnel, and slowly John Henry and Little Bill began to pull even with the new steam drill. Finally, the men and the machine were neck and neck. It means they're tied. Suddenly, the machine started to cough and wheeze. Just as John Henry and Little Bill pulled ahead, the steam drill started chugging and shaking. Then it choked and died. John Henry had won the race. But even then, he didn't stop. He just kept right on going. A few minutes later, there was a great splintering sound, and slivers of rock flew all around. Bright golden light came pouring into the black tunnel. John Henry had broke through to the other side of the mountain. The Big Bend tunnel was finished. John Henry stood there for a moment, staring at the last rays of the setting sun.
Is that the steam drill?
Mm-hmm.
John Henry and his hammer can beat steam drills.
Then, as the crowd started cheering wildly, he turned and waved to his friends. Polly Ann rushed toward him, but before she could hug him, John Henry stumbled and fell to his knees. "Get him a doctor," the track foreman shouted, but John Henry shook his head. Then he looked up at his Polly Ann. "I said that hammer was gonna be the death of me one day," he whispered. "Just make sure they write on my grave that I was a steel-driving man." And taking his Polly Ann's hand, John Henry breathed his last. The task had been too much for even his great heart, and so it was that John Henry died, still holding a hammer in his hand. Polly Ann had him buried right there at the mouth of the Big Bend tunnel, and on his tombstone she had written just what he'd asked: "Here lies a steel-driving man." Although John Henry is gone, you can still hear him and his hammer singing all across this land. Whenever you hear a train rolling across the wide countryside or howling through a dark tunnel, listen. Whenever you hear train wheels squealing against those big steel rails, or a train whistle blowing at the midnight moon, listen, and you will hear the song of John Henry. The end. What do you
Daddy,
think?
why did he die after we did that?
It was too much for even his heart, I guess.
Maybe.